Hi there. Welcome to the first of our new series of Resource Futures webinars, Urgent Conversations. This is our new series all about the most important topics and problems that are affecting the world of resources and how we can solve them. We've got an absolutely brilliant lineup today for our conversation about e-waste and how we can reverse the tide of e-waste. First of all, a couple of things. I'm Ben McCabe. I'm the marketing manager of Resource Futures. We are a environmental consultancy specializing in data, circular economy, and policy and communities. So we've got a lot to get through today. So I'm going to go straight into talking about the guest that we've got today. Just as a bit of an introduction, in a nutshell, what do you guys do and how are you associated with e-waste? Let's start with you, Scott.
Thanks. This is not my house. I'm in a fancy hotel, just for avoidance of doubt. I'm Scott Butler. I'm the Executive Director of Material Focus. We do many things around all things electricals, and not least, we run the Recycle Your Electricals campaign, and we are the creator of that annoying cat, Hypno cat, that's doing arounds all over the UK in regular occasions too. But we also work across repair, fixing, recycling your electricals.
Brilliant. Paula?
Hi everyone, I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at WWF UK. Hopefully everyone will have heard of WWF. We're the world's largest independent conservation organisation. But my involvement is I'm the Policy Lead on Circular Economy, and I worked closely with Resource Futures to produce a report with our partner Vodafone looking at the fast phones culture in the UK and the impacts of our ever increasing tech usage on the environment and attitudes from consumers towards that. Thank you.
Okay, tell us about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm a co-founder and co-director of the Restart Project. We are a UK-based charity promoting repair and a return to a repair economy and bringing together the repair community, hundreds of repair cafes to push for a true, authentic and real right to repair. So we try to prevent e-waste from happening and empower people to keep and use their products for longer.
Brilliant. And James?
Thanks. Yes, I look after all things governance, risk and compliance for Blackmore UK. Blackmore are a secure IT asset disposition company based in the Southwest. So we handle e-waste on behalf of our clients, ensuring that the residual data is sanitized. They get their data destruction certificates, and we then work to make that e-waste not waste anymore, push in reuse wherever possible, and where it has to be recycled, making sure the recycling is done responsibly and effectively.
And Sarah, a little bit about your role.
Hi, so I've had the privilege of working with everybody here today, working as behaviour change lead at Resource Futures. My work spans the fast phones work with Paula, communities work with Hugo, Scott and James through our Fixie project, and we also run community action groups across Somerset and Devon. The foundation of Resource Futures is in community action. So the topic of e-waste crops up in many aspects of our work through circular economy and the communities work and our policy work. So why e-waste? Obviously e-waste is a significant issue within the UK. There's about 2.2 million tonnes of electricals brought and put onto the market. We have recycling collections for that, but we can see the fast consumption, the impact it's going to have long term. We're going to run through a number of different aspects of that with each person. Scott, I wanted to start with you on this one. Obviously, Material Focus have played a huge role in normalising household recycling through the HypnoCat campaign, which has been hugely successful. I think you launched that back in 2020, so it's been running for 5 years now. And it's really strengthened behaviours around people and how they dispose of But e-waste is a really fast-moving landscape. So can you tell me what you've seen at Material Focus in terms of how the e-waste landscape has changed since 2020?
Yes, happy to. I mean, we launched in March 2020. So some of you may recall something happened around that time. And we were about to launch a campaign which was getting the people out and about recycling their electricals. And one day later, the government told everybody to stay at home for quite a long time. So we've now called that a pivot. We pivoted and decided to lean into the fact that lots of people were at home and decluttering and all those things, and they should bag up their electricals. But in our first sort of 5 years, our focus was on dealing with the pressing challenge at the time, and that was that too many electricals were being binned. or held on to unnecessarily. So we wanted to make recycling the worst thing that people do with their electricals rather than binning them. But we were always talking about reuse, and donation and other elements too, and we always have been. But that was a sort of a priority focus, was lifting that bar up. And when we started, there were 3,000 listed donation points in the UK. We've now got 30,000 donation points in the UK. We've funded 70 pilots that have made it easier for 12.5 million people in the UK to reuse, donate, recycle their electricals, and we'll continue to work on that. But sort of, I guess, two major things that we've noticed in that time is the onset of what we called fast tech, and the sort of poster child for that is the vape, the dreaded vape, which has just hit the market essentially around the same time that we started and suddenly grew. And, when we first did the research in 2022, there were 1 million of them being binned and littered. Next time we did the research a year later, that had gone to 4 million, struck 5 million. And the last time we did it around December last year, it was at 8 million a week were being binned and littered. So 8 million dangerous, toxic fire sticks were distributed all across the UK. So arguably the most environmentally wasteful, dangerous, toxic consumer product ever sold has happened in our time. I'm pleased to say that we were telling everybody about it, but I'm also not pleased to say that we didn't really stop it either. And we're still dealing with the challenges of that. But it's also this rise of other fast tech, cheap earpods, the rise of Shein and Temu, you £1 cables, £3 earpods, mini fans in the summer. Even Stormzy and Helen Mirren are on the front page of the Telegraph with their fast tech, and people say, "Oh, isn't that cute?" So that's one big thing that we're dealing with. And then the other thing that we're dealing with some of the colleagues on the line here is that also this fast disposal of useful tech. The fact that we throw away so much that could be repaired, could be reused, could be used for longer. So those two things are sort of what are probably going to be our theme going forward, is how do we deal with fast tech, but how do we promote better use of products, long life of products, all those other things.
We're seeing a shift into new types of tech as well, aren't they? We've talked about kind of textiles and tech entering textiles and the whole medical field with people with blood pressure machines at home. How big an issue is that, do you think?
I think it's a growing issue. I like to name things. So we had fad tech, which is things like air fryers and bread makers. We have fast tech, which I've just described. And now we have fash tech, which is e-textiles and the heated gilets and things like that, and sports equipment. And that's full of copper wires. Often it's got lithium-ion batteries in it. And if they go in with a normal textile, it's very likely that they will be compacted and baled. And that's the worst thing that you can do with anything that's got a lithium-ion battery inside it, because that's what will trigger a fire. So that's something that we're starting to look at. And then, the rise, the good thing is the accessibility of technology. Technology can deliver a lot of value to us. And in the medical sense, you've got people with, blood pressure monitors, heart rate monitors, those sort of things. And they're being proliferated out. But what happens with them, the challenges associated with them around hygiene and all these other things. So, tech is evolving all the time. And what we've seen with vapes is that it can pose significant challenges. And we're spending a lot of time looking, the Donald Rumsfeld, the known knowns and unknown knowns, the unknown unknowns. It's coming. There's stuff that's going to come that's going to pose us some challenges. Med tech and fash tech. I've launched it here today. You sort of have to say it in a Dutch, South African accent, I think, is something that we're starting to be concerned about as well.
Brilliant. That's really useful. Ugo, I'm going to move on to you. I remember the first time I saw someone buy a mobile phone. It's going to give away my age, but it was huge and cumbersome and expensive, and I didn't know why they were bothered. But obviously technology changes so fast. And like Scott was saying just then, people are consuming things in a really fast fashion and in many different waste sectors. And this is giving us that real linear model. So how can we continue the shift away from that create use waste and throwing it away, and get people away from that kind of from a status symbol of having the latest of everything, move towards a more circular outcome?
Yeah, I would agree with most of what Scott said about the emergence of the fast tech. Fash tech maybe seems to mean possibly two different things, but anyway, let's not get there. But I think there's another aspect that we should also focus on, which is the fact that for many people, they don't necessarily have the desire to continue upgrade their products. buy a new one. But in fact, we've been chronicling, supporting, and aggregating this advance in community and other sources of desire to keep things in use for much longer. And I remember when we started back in 2012, start with our first restart party. We were the very first in the whole of the UK to run community repair activities. The latest count on the Community Repair Network website seems to show 782 community repair cafes and other similar initiatives all over the country. And every single week, there seems to be a launch of at least a new group. So there is another story, which is about how do we bring back repair and how do we make sure that all the barriers to keeping things for longer are actually removed. And essential to that is a return to a real right to repair. So it is something that's now become talked about a lot more. But what exactly is the right to repair? The right to repair is something that's unfortunately missing at the moment, both the right for people to use products that are designed to last and to be easy to disassemble and to repair. So requiring that manufacturers of products have to make them easy to repair and sell spare parts at a reasonable price, and I'll get to this, make sure that the software that powers these products is also supported for a long period of time. So that's the work on eco-design, which the UK is still behind in adopting. We are in parallel with the work on the UK. We are also one of the leading organizations in the Right to Repair Europe coalition, which is pushing for European legislation that's making some progress, including on the smartphones that you mentioned, Sarah. So the next phone that you'll buy, if it's not refurbished, which is always better, if it's a new phone, will be more long-lasting and more repairable with more durable batteries that you need to replace less frequently. So we are making some progress. But meanwhile, fast tech is happening. And so there are aspects about right to repair, not just from the design, but from the consumer rights aspect that we need also more protection for. And so we need to make sure the manufacturers are allowing us to have access to the parts and to allowing community groups as well as independent repair businesses to provide these repair services that are needed to keep us from replacing products so much. And the UK hopefully will catch up, and we're eagerly awaiting for the results of the Circular Economy Task Force. And we hope indeed that the prioritizing electricals and electronics will indeed happen, and that DEFRA will take action based on that. But an example that I must mention, and it's this week, was both E-Waste Day a couple of days ago, and it's International Repair Day, which is celebrated with 3,000 plus events in almost 45 countries at the latest count. And the key theme this year is software obsolescence, how we can't allow companies such as Microsoft to simply stop providing software updates for products that cannot be upgraded to the next generation of operating system. The example I'm making is based on the Windows 10 scandal that is leaving potentially 400 million people with not very many options other than replacing their device. And often devices that could be just fine for browsing the web, emails, and what most people use their computers for. So we're far from winning. We're making some progress, but definitely while we ask people to consume less, we need to ask manufacturers to help us not trash perfectly fine products.
Super interesting. And the timing around the Windows 10 change is it's a good timing for our webinar today because it's such a current topic. It brings me nicely on to James. I want to talk to you about waste. And obviously, we've heard from Ugo there about the rise in community activities and the repair cafes, the restart parties. It's really easy, I find, to live in this happy bubble that we can see that third sector growing and the activity around it increasing. And recently we saw Donate IT featured on the One Show as the lead item, which is really exciting to see. But we're also aware from our work with WWF UK, the consumer research around the fast phone showed that a lot of people are not actually engaging in donation and repair of items. So there's outside our bubble, there's a huge amount of people who are not yet in this space. So how can we move? So they're already putting stuff into waste, and we need to make it more mainstream. So how can we move technology out of the waste stream and more into those repair and reuse channels?
So it's a huge question to try and sort of succinctly wrap an answer around. But I think a word that's come up a number of times already is consumer. And I don't want to put everything at the door of the consumer, because really it's on all of us to make sure that consumption habits change. And I think a lot of that comes from perception. You've got your fast tech and your fast tech, as Scott coined earlier. There are all these trends. And of course, vapes. I think vapes are perhaps indicative of a sort of wider consumer issue where everything is treated as single use. And that extends into IT, which for some reason has always occupied this space where you'll have a user who owns that piece of equipment and it is, tucked at the back of their drawer or in the back of a big IT cupboard, or otherwise abandoned as useless at the point at which they no longer wish to use it. An analogy that I often return to is that of a used car. And I think we need to kind of make people think differently about IT equipment as a second user, third user and beyond, because there are people that quite happily use that equipment. And Hugo, of course, already touched on the fact that making that equipment able to be repaired and making sure that equipment remains, supported with software updates to be secure, etc., is all sort of part and parcel of that. You can't really extend the life of this equipment if those factors aren't there. But I think the consumer aspect of it also drives the innovation behind the equipment. So you've got your annual release schedule of your iPhones, for example, and they follow the consumer demand for things like waterproofing the devices. Now, that was a great change for clumsy people, but it was also a great change for the manufacturer because it meant they could seal the device up tight and stop people from fixing it. So if we would have maybe changed the way that people look at how repairable things are versus various quick conveniences, there might be a sort of longer term capability of keeping this equipment out of the waste stream.
That's really interesting. And there often are these kind of unintended consequences, aren't there? We see the same with lightweighting, where manufacturers are incentivized to reduce the amount of material used in the items, but then that requires things to be more glued rather than being more modular. So again, we're taking away the reusability and the recyclability. Paula, I'd like to come on to you. Hugo, did you want to say something on that topic?
Yeah, super quick. Just to say that waterproofing doesn't necessarily result in products being impossible to repair. There are good examples of designs that allow for products being waterproof and still be repaired. We just need to champion those designs and help avoid those cases where manufacturers might try to force us into like an either or, because there are solutions, and great innovation helps people get what we need without making it impossible to repair.
Yeah, it's a really good point. There's no one wonder for everything. There are so many variations and important to champion those. Paula, I wanted to touch on the consumer point that James brought up. And of course, consumers are the people who are buying the tech. But this area is really complicated, isn't it? That technology plays a really intimate role. The lives of consumers and the relationship a person may have with their tech can be very sensitive. From your point of view, how does e-waste relate to digital poverty? And what's the opportunity for one to impact the other?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And the work we did together for the Vodafone WWF Fast Phones report really touched on some of those areas around consumers. In fact, it really wholly focused on the consumer research, the novel consumer research that was done related to consumer attitudes. Data security has already been mentioned by James, and this was definitely something that came up, that when sort of thinking about recycling or handing on their phones, data security was an issue for consumers. So, I mean, I won't go into the policy recommendations that we came into, so I'm sure we'll have a wider conversation about policy levers, enablers, and that also, the thing that was of concern for me is that consumers don't understand the wider environmental impacts associated with their phones. And from my point of view, that's in relation to the mining of the critical raw materials that need to go into these smart tech devices, as well as, the usual suspect of plastic being in a lot of these products. There's just a lack of awareness of those environmental impacts, and therefore behaviors aren't, for consumers that are concerned about the environment, it's not even registering for them. And then the opportunity, there's lack of awareness of digital poverty in the UK. And like you say, Sarah, we all have this, arguably slightly irrational, but let's face it, quite emotional connection to our phones. It's devastating if we think, I can't find my phone, Sarah, or I've lost this or that or the other. And we do have that sense of like, oh my gosh, my life is falling apart because we've become so dependent on it. But we forget about the millions of people who either don't have access to any kind of technology or have access to technology which is now, through the example of the Windows 10 obsolescence, is now completely pointless to them. And we have to be mindful of this. And so many services are moving online where to get favourable bills for electricity and energy, you have to have online banking to be able to set up direct debits, to make hospital appointments, or to order your pharmacy, your medicines. A lot of that, it's faster, cheaper, quicker to do that all online. So we are disadvantaging those people who don't have access to the right kind of tech. And it's a growing problem, and one that we as a collective need to raise awareness of.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We run an education project in Devon, and our team did a little talk with students around the impacts of a mobile phone from a mining perspective. And people were crying in the room. It was really emotional, and people were they felt really challenged about being told you possibly shouldn't be putting so much emphasis on your phone. It's a topic that it's very hard to communicate at the moment because people aren't in that right space. James, I know you've got you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to sort of make mention of the exclusive nature, in fact, of a great number of services increasingly. A lot of the government gateway services, NHS services, and even things moving into web-only support. A lot of companies now don't even have a helpline. They just have a live chat. So you have to be online for it. Just to sort of illustrate further Paula's point, really, in terms of the digital divide and actually how that divide's getting larger as these services are excluding people that don't have access to this technology. And so some of the equipment, some of the work that we do, in fact, Blackmore with Donate IT is addressing that, or doing as much as we can at least. But there's a lot to be done in terms of getting equipment out there. And also that can sometimes mean that the equipment that we can't get consumers on board with for purchasing as a second user environment, it still may be perfectly usable to these individuals that need access to these services. And it actually also, I might just briefly mention, that it does go beyond the physical device itself. A laptop's only so good for these things if it also has access to the internet. And that's another challenge that we collectively need to address.
We've talked a lot about all the problems, but of course, we're talking here about reversing the tide of e-waste. So it's important to look at the positive sides of what's happening across the sector. We've got some great players here who are already championing work there. Paula, I think it's an interesting point to come back to consumers, because it's easy to think that they are that first point of call. But the research we did with you around fast phones showed that actually the emphasis on a consumer at this point in time isn't really the best place to be putting energy. And it may be in the future, but right now people still have that huge emotional connection. We still have the digital poverty issues. From the work that we did together, it looked at that wider piece. What do you believe are the key regulatory and market opportunities that we should be looking at above the consumer element with regards to e-waste?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, Sarah, because since we did that research and since we published the report, actually the political landscape has changed significantly, and it's changing every day essentially. But I think now, and in the recent weeks, something that is coming up so often is this idea of resilience. So actually resilience, whether it's food system resilience, whether it's resource resilience and resource security, I think that there's an opportunity to frame it within all of that. A stat that I discovered recently is that 40% of conflicts in the last 60 years have been related to resource exploitation. And I think that carries on. And we really have to think about this whole system, regardless of whether it's e-waste or regardless of it's another waste stream. I work a lot on packaging. it's within that context of resource resilience. And I think it is impossible to put it all on the consumer. It is not fair to put it all on the consumer because there's so much more that the government could be doing and actors within the whole value chain system to support consumers to do better and behave and shift their behaviors. And I think that, there's a question I think that's come up in relation to tax. It's one thing that we've been calling for. And actually, I'm going to be transparent. It was an area of contention with our corporate partners working on the report about zero VAT rate on repairs. It's something we've been calling for, not just in the e-waste sector, but also around construction, and very much noises around how fiscal levers can support really big shifts in behaviour across a lot of resource and waste intensive sectors. So there's definitely a lot we can do. The government have consulted on a couple of years ago now, but nothing's come of it because we've had a change of administration in the meantime, around extended producer responsibility for electricals, or greater extended producer responsibility. There is a form of it in at the moment, but also curbside recycling. So being a bit more parochial, thinking about my local environment group, they are very much talking about, well, it's got to be convenient. Why can't we just pop our small electricals in our curbside bins? So, what are the steps that need to make that happen if it means we're going to suddenly double, triple, quadruple the amount of tech that we get back to either recycle, reuse, repair? So there's so many things. We could have a webinar solely on policy levers, I think. So I'm just going to stop there for the moment.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And Ugo, I was going to bring you in next to talk on the topic of the work that you're doing at Restart projects, obviously playing a huge role in driving consumer change. Policy is hugely important, and you're also working in that policy landscape. But the work that you're doing around supporting community repair networks, that Restart party model, and the fact that you embrace repair cafes as well, which is marvelous. We know the sector is growing, but there is still a lot more to be done to get more people on board. How can we widen access to repair and reuse when it comes specifically to electricals, and reduce the costs around this? I know you've got some quite innovative approaches that you've been trialing at the Restart project, so it'd be interesting to hear about some of those.
So we think that community repair, as in repair cafes, are great, yet they happen once a week or once a month, depending on the location, for 3 hours, while things break all of the time. And most people can't necessarily take part in the events. So we've been trialing in London a new model, and we're certainly not the only people doing that. So an evolution of community spaces that kind of makes them more permanent space in high streets. They're called Fixing Factories. This is a project funded by the National Lottery that we're doing in collaboration with another charity called Possible in London. We have 3. We tested things for a while, and now we have 2 and a third one that's launching next week in London, with a work ongoing on launching a 4th one. So the idea of these spaces is these are places where you can access tools and skills and learn skills, do courses to increase your level of confidence on repair, learning specific repair skills, and contributing to community repair initiatives and repair cafes and the likes. So this is a model that's also kind of highlighting what's been happening in our high street. So the fact that a lot of these skills have vanished progressively from the high street, and some of these professions are becoming a risk of being extinct completely. So we also need to rebuild through the Fixing Factories and through work in making repair more affordable, rebuilding a local repair economy. So the real green jobs. And as part of that, we're doing another innovative trial, which is the first in the UK of a voucher scheme. Through this program, which is funded by North London Waste Authority, and we're doing it in partnership with ReLondon and a software company called Fix First. We are allowing residents in North London to save 50% of the cost of a repair, so making it affordable so that people choose to repair rather than replace a product. And we're getting a lot of interest and increasingly a lot of people that would have been or recycle their product to actually do the right thing. So this is one of the key demands, by the way, of our repair and reuse declaration, which already has over 430 organizations between community projects, businesses, and national charities that have signed it, and over 80 MPs have now endorsed it. So the pressure is growing to make sure that we have right to repair legislation, tax and other financial incentives, repair and reuse targets, and more skills in repair. So why am I mentioning reuse? Because the two are really linked. Like, of course, this webinar is about e-waste. How do we reverse the tide? Well, partly reversing the tide is also about making sure that a lot of what ends up currently as e-waste actually shouldn't have been e-waste to begin with. And so we should make sure that we have ambitious reuse targets. When last year we crowdsourced through work with volunteers from our network, information that was not available publicly in any organized way about the network of reuse and recycling centers in the UK. Please note they're called reuse and recycling centers. We discovered that only 19% of all the recycling centers in the UK have a pathway for any of the products that are taken there to be reused. Now, we think it should be 100% of them, and that there should be legislations to require a certain percentage of potential e-waste to actually be filtered out for reuse. Of course, it happens in other places as well, but for many people, the right place will probably be the collection point. So it's a lot of things that need to happen. Yeah, so we need to push for this coherent collective vision that can unlock a lot of new opportunities.
James, did you want to make a comment around this topic?
I did actually, although it did actually end up sort of covering off quite nicely the fact that whilst having the right to repair it is extremely important in this challenge, as he pointed out, a good number of the equipment that ends up as waste, it doesn't even need repair. It just may require the data to be sanitized and it be prepared for the next user. So that was a solid point. Thanks for clearing that up. I did just want to ask, in terms of the right to repair, how that links in with not just the ability to repair the device, but the availability of the spares for the device. Because I know that some vendors have been challenging at times in terms of getting them to make spares available in the open market and that sort of thing.
Of course, there's now a lot of talk about right to repair. The reality is that the legislation that have passed, at least at European level, and that the UK benefits in part from, or will benefit at least in part from, only cover a very small minority of the product categories that are normally seen at repair cafes. I mean, research we did on data from over 200,000 repair attempts of all kinds of small electrical and electronics that are brought to community repair initiatives shows that only 4% of these products are covered by the right to repair legislation today. So when we talk about your kettle, your toaster, your coffee maker, your blender, your vacuum cleaner, there's no such thing as a right to repair yet. Nowhere basically in the world. So there's a lot of work to be done, which also is a reminder that since that work at policy level will continue to take time and will never be perfect, we need to invest massively in making the case for it. At business level, we're looking forward to see more businesses and companies coming forward and want to work, maybe also with us, on making this change at a scale that actually can affect the global population of the UK and beyond, because it's not going to be fixed by just one piece of legislation. While we want to change the law to make it easier by design for everyone, it requires a lot more. We need a fixing factory in every high street. We need taxation to be removed. We need incentives and a lot more.
James, you mentioned before about the digital side of it, the wiping and the issues around that. One thing is about how we get people to get more engaged with that, and how can we make consumers more confident in donating their devices? Because obviously people are really aware that we've talked quite a lot today about how consumers are so attached to their devices. There's a lot invested in them and there's a lot of personal information on them. And my parents are looking to donate some stuff to a tech amnesty coming up in November, but they're really worried about the data on it. And even though somebody is offering a data wiping service, they want us to do it first because they're nervous. And I'm sure that's quite prevalent. So how do we help consumers gain confidence in that so we can start moving things in a more circular?
Yeah, thanks. So you're absolutely right. It is a big barrier for people. And the theory behind it is that it should be a barrier in that you don't want that data to get into the wrong hands. But that there are mechanisms in place to actually handle that. And one of the biggest, when you're looking at consumer donations in particular, as you sort of alluded to, is to look at working with a sort of charity outlet that actually partner with professional IT asset management companies, Donate IT being one example of where the equipment will be sort of certified, sanitized as part of the process. But it sort of outside of the consumer confidence side of it, you also have the wider issue of technology waste from business. And, they have additional burdens on them through the Data Protection Act, GDPR, etc., that basically require them to handle the data that may be residual on that equipment much more carefully and have much better record keeping in terms of what they've done to fulfill their obligations. And again, that's where engaging with a professional IT asset management company is where you want to be. Those are definitely factors. I think, as Scott was mentioning just now, making people aware of how they can do some pretty straightforward steps to do a reasonable job of sanitizing their equipment before they donate it to others is definitely a good thing. And then getting that word out there is important too. But yeah, sort of for that total reassurance, you just want the full circle covered by companies that are certified as knowing what they're doing. The other area in terms of the challenges we've got getting this equipment into a reusable state are things like iCloud lock and MDM, so device management, particularly in corporate equipment, where if it's not removed appropriately as part of that initial release of those assets, then that may impede the reuse capability of that equipment. So making sure people are aware as well that, not only do they need to remove the data or have a company successfully remove the data for them, but they really should make an effort to make that equipment prepared, ready for a second user environment.
And that's a really critical point, isn't it? Because there's so much obsolescence in items. I've seen a whole pile of them at Donate IT where they haven't been disconnected from the Apple Cloud, and so they can't be used. They're perfectly good, but you can't get them ready for reuse. And getting that message out is going to be really important, isn't it, to increase the circularity. Great. Thanks, everyone. It's been really interesting covering all those topics. Ben, do we have any questions from the floor at all?
We have dozens of questions from the floor. We will try and get through as many of them as we can in the next 8 or so minutes. Any that we don't get, we will be picking our panel's brains a little bit and trying to put out a little an article with some of this information in afterwards. Let's start with this one. So this is from Steve. He's asking about keeping software updated, such as Windows 10, potentially being useful as a form of EPR. Ugo, I think you might have an opinion on that one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In a sense, I think we need to shift away from manufacturers' interest in just churning out the next generation of a product and instead having to focus on supporting the products that they manufacture for much longer. I mean, polling data we released this week show that 63% of all British people had to throw away prematurely a product in the last 3 years. So it's not just Windows and Microsoft. But think about this. Microsoft is not stopping to develop and keep up to date software updates for security purposes for Windows 10. What it's doing is restricting access to them. So in a sense, I think it should be mandatory once you put a product onto this world to be responsible for that product to stay in use for as long as possible. So we're asking for 15 years of software updates for all products. So that should help reduce e-waste. And EPR, indeed, I mean, the same way that in the French repair voucher scheme works, it's funded completely by EPR. So a portion of the money used to take care of the e-waste generated by electronics is actually used to reduce the amount that are becoming waste by reducing the cost of keeping them in use for longer. So this case is parallel. Let's use some of that money, if needed, to fund the extension of software support.
So 10% of UK adults, that's 5.3 million people, are in digital poverty, and 8%, so 4.3 million, have zero digital skills, with 12% having a limited amount of digital skills. So that's nearly 6.5 million UK adults having limited or no digital skills. James, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, only that it sort of depends on how the statistics are put together, because there's also the report that 45% of households with children were found to fall below what's considered the minimum digital living standard. So I know that's 45% of a subset of the population, but then you could look at that and recognize that there might be a disproportionate impact on households with children.
For sure. My stats were the ONS stats, which obviously, yeah, they're the official ones, but they don't always necessarily cover the full picture, do they? And that was only adults rather than including in children as well. Yeah, thanks for that. Paula, did you have anything you wanted to add before we move on to the next question on that?
Not to that specifically, but I wanted to come back on EPR actually, and just thinking more broadly about the kind of systems overhaul that we need. I'm a bit concerned that there's the risk that we do over focus on what we do to make consumers behave differently. And I really think that we have to focus on the policies that government can put in place to incentivize, for instance, businesses to shift to different models. And I know there was a question and some comments in there about sharing economy, and given that single person households are ever increasing, and does everybody in a block of flats need to have an ironing board, an iron, a drill, all those items, when also those households will be quite small from a space point of view. So, there's things like that. But I think also the comment from Polly, I think it was, welcome back from New Zealand, but on vapes, I mean, absolutely, they should never have made it onto the market in the first place. But this really highlights the lack of join up across government policy. And I think, let's give credit, or some credit, to the current government who are making an effort to try and join up policy areas and ensure that different departments have got responsibility for different aspects of policy measures. But that was one area where, for instance, OPSS, the Office for Product Safety and Security, or whatever it's called, they would have looked at it purely from a technical point of view and gone, yes, this is safe to go on the market. But actually, nobody looked at it from a full life cycle perspective. And so we really need to do that across all design. And I think in the same way that packaging EPR is sort of a bonus malus system where you pay a higher fee if your packaging isn't recyclable, and there's degrees of that, actually, we should be grouping different tech-related products, electronic items, into different categories. You've got those completely pointless, meaningless, one-time use only types of products, which should be heavily penalised if they want to go on the market, almost prohibitively so, that it disincentivises that product from coming on the market, or ensures that if the product does come on the market, that it's a more meaningful and more useful item and has got longevity, repairability. And then you reward, from a fee point of view, repairability, longevity, recyclability, etc. So, maybe I'm being a bit reductive about the whole thing, but you can categorize those sort of cheap, pointless items. Let's either ban them, let's make it punitively expensive to place them on the market, and let's try and shift businesses to change their behavior and think about what they place on the market, because they put that rubbish on the market, they're going to be charged a lot for it. And they're often really cheap, low margin products anyway. So they'll be looking at their business model and going, it's not worth us putting it on. So I think there's so much that can be done without even then having to, let's not even offer consumers light up jumpers for Christmas. Who needed one? Nobody knew they needed one until it was offered to them. And then all of a sudden, everybody wants them.
I didn't want to take anything at all away from what Paula was saying there, because I agree with 99.9% of it. The only sort of stipulation I'd suggest for caution is that, sometimes if we make bold policy changes, the one that's really jumping to mind are things like the sort of so-called sugar tax, whether there's a risk that what we may end up inadvertently doing is just cutting people out of the ability to keep up with the rest of society. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's a need for any of this fast tech and things like that. But sometimes if we're not careful about how legislation is worded, for example, it may inadvertently increase the cost of more sustainable technologies and actually price them out for the market too.
Yeah, I'll just come back on that. And absolutely, all policy that is trying to overhaul a system has got to be looked at through the lens of a just transition, the unintended consequences, the perverse consequences that might arise. But I think that, where we've seen those unintended consequences and perverse consequences from some recent policies. So I'm going to pick again on the single-use plastic bag charge, where actually overall the material that's going into bags for life is far greater than we ever had from single use. But the success metric was to drive down the consumption of single-use plastic bags and the litter associated with them. So tick, it did that, but it didn't have the holistic thinking around the success metrics and the KPIs. So hopefully the learning curves there, that we can ensure there's equitable, just transition approaches in all policies. So it does lead to meaningful, impactful change and economic growth, which of course is the top priority for the government at the moment.
Yeah, I saw a question from Joe, I think, on how can we influence large global manufacturers in the UK? So the UK is said to benefit, at least to an extent, of existing right to repair legislation that's been developed out of the EU and or the US, depending on the product category, because for software obsolescence, for example, if it's banned in one part of the world, physically, it's unlikely that the same product will be supported for shorter period of times in different parts of the world. So in a sense, we like to talk this kind of like the Olympics of right to repair. For certain aspects of right to repair, the EU is leading, other bits the US, and there's hope for that the UK can lead on something. So for example, the UK could decide that for a product to be sold in the UK, it needs to be guaranteed a certain minimum period of software support before they stop. Because right now, legislation in the UK, which was a first, requires manufacturers to place information about how long they will support the products for, but it has no requirement for how long should that be. So how about we turn that almost pointless label right now into saying you need to state that you will support it for 15 years and then actually make it happen. So it is possible, but largely it will be determined by a range of policies that are not all defined at UK level.
There's something akin to conformity assessment that actually requires a minimum length of support would absolutely be a good move. And I know in terms of the EU leading the charge on a number of right to repair bits and pieces, I've seen recently that there's been a bit of a reversal on the Windows 10 decision, but that's only in effect for the European Economic Area. So the UK's rather shot itself in the foot on that one. But yeah, hopefully some of the changes that Microsoft in this particular example make will bleed over into the UK because of, frankly, it's easier to manage one solution than lots. So fingers crossed.
That's all we've got time for. Thank you, everybody who's joined today. Thank you to Paula, Ugo, James, and Sarah, and also Scott, who unfortunately had to drop out with a couple of signal issues. We will be doing another webinar on recycling innovation in early November. You can go to resourcefutures.co.uk and find all of the information you need for it on that one. So yes, thank you very much, and we hope to see you at the next one. Goodbye.